Hi,
Um, there you are. How you doing, man? You doing all right this morning?
I'm great. How about yourself?
I am doing great. I am disturbed, let's say, about world events and the way things have been going. But Caleb, let me bring you in. Caleb Maupin is a speaker, writer, journalist, political analyst, and author. In his new book, in his book, Kamala Harris and the Future of America, an essay in three parts, he examines the life of Kamala Harris and puts her rise to prominence in context of changing U.S. political discourse and geopolitical stage. Caleb, man, I really appreciate you joining me. Thank you. Caleb,
Absolutely.
I want to get into what is happening in Syria right now. And I want to get your take on this. So, I guess the first question, it seems that Aleppo, or the very least parts of Aleppo, has fallen. Um, why weren't they more aware? Meaning, how did they get caught unaware? Because the war had never stopped, the war was always frozen. And they knew that those terrorists, tens of thousands, were in Idlib. I would imagine they had to have intelligence that they were being trained, even trained by Ukrainian forces, no less, but still backed by Turkey, backed by NATO. How did they get caught so unaware in this moment?
Well, many people felt that the Syrian conflict had completely de escalated. You'll recall that the Syrian government was readmitted into the Arab League, and that it seemed like almost a consensus among Western leaders that the conflict was over. The Syrian government was going to remain intact. Uh, and now it appears to me that Joe Biden and the American intelligence apparatus and Pentagon military industrial complex, they're very afraid of what's going to happen when Donald Trump takes office. And so not only are they escalating the conflict in Ukraine and going full speed ahead, pedal to the metal, trying to escalate that conflict as much as they possibly can. They're trying to flare up yet another confrontation where Russia is on one side and NATO is on the other. Now, when it comes to Syria, let's understand why Russia and Syria have a close relationship. Syria, they were a colony of the French for many years, and it was under the leadership of Hafez Assad, Bashar Assad's father, that they became an independent socialist country with the ideology of Ba'athist Arab socialism. And it was with the help of the Soviet Union that they built their first hydroelectrical power plants. They built their medical system, which has been very widely praised by Avincia Journal of Medicine. And they wiped out illiteracy in the country, and they've had many achievements since the 1980s and 90s as a result of their anti-colonial revolution. Ba'athist Arab socialism is the ideology upon which they're based. The Communist Party is part of the coalition of the government. So is the Syrian Social Nationalist Party. And it's kind of a coalition of different socialist and anti-imperialist forces that have taken power under the leadership of the Ba'athist Arab Socialist government. And they have been big funders of Palestinian resistance over the years. They very much see themselves as coming out of anti-colonial struggles, etc. And because of that, they've been a target of the United States and of NATO for a long time. And also because of that, from the time they had their revolution, the Russians, the Soviet Union, was a big ally and friend that helped them industrialize and build. And they made a point of not pivoting toward an alliance with the U.S. aligned Arab states, right? There was talk about would they build a pipeline for Saudi Arabia and Qatar. They rejected it, and they had plans to build a pipeline to help Iran export oil to the Mediterranean. There was a whole plan that they had where Iran, was a very rich oil producing country. They were going to build a pipeline connecting Iran to the Mediterranean so Iranian oil exports could greatly expand. They're allies of the Islamic Republic of Iran. And this is geopolitics, but it's been going on for quite some time, since 2011. We've seen the killing in Syria continue, and there has been all kinds of lies in Western media. They've tried to say that this is a result of the Arab Spring protests. Well, there were many people who protested during the Arab Spring who wanted more transparency in the government, wanted more human rights, etc. And the overwhelming majority of the people that protested against the Syrian government in 2011 now support the government because the people fighting against them in the civil war are jihadists and extremists who want to set up, some kind of caliphate and set up some kind of Islamist government that would be, a flashback to the 1400s. The Syrian government has protected the Christian community that have been a target of the Islamic jihadist extremists backed by the United States. The Syrian government has protected religious minorities, and that it's very clear that the victory of these forces that the United States is backing, which seemed to be completely, at least, almost entirely, defeated. But now Biden is escalating their strength in the hopes of just creating as much of a mess as he possibly can before leaving office. It seemed those forces had been defeated, but they now are escalating. Look, the Syrian government is going to stay in power. There's no question about it. The Syrian people see the Syrian government as the force that is in opposition to jihadism, extremism, and chaos. They look at Iraq and how great Iraq has been doing since the USA overthrew the government. They look at Libya and how great Libya has been doing ever since the USA overthrew the government. And they say, do we want that to come here? No, we don't. And I guess the Syrian government, despite whatever its flaws, that is the force that is the opposition. Syria's relationship with China has really strengthened in the last couple of years. China has made a point of really escalating their, economic trade deals and such with Syria. The Syrian government's going to remain in power.
I guess that was going to be the other question. Is the Syrian government strong enough to push these forces back? I saw that Russia had a punishing attack on the militants that were part of this kind of terrorist organization itself. Why didn't these warriors of Islam attack Israel? I mean, Israel had been murdering Muslims indiscriminately for the last year in Lebanon, Palestine, and even in Syria itself. So if they were this, group that represents the interests of Islam, why no attacks on Israel in this case? I mean, that should be one of the fascinating questions. And I understand that they may have thought this war was over, but those terrorists were still there. And more to the point, they were talking about the fact that they were going to attack Syria. So I don't know. I guess it will. I mean, I'm saying heads roll. That's probably a bad way to put it. But I mean, do you agree with the fact that they were failures, either in intelligence or in capability, that allowed this to take place?
Well, if you want to know why these forces are not attacking Israel, these forces were specifically cultivated during the Obama administration to believe that the primary enemy of Muslims is the Shia. And there's a whole current that developed after the overthrow of the Iraqi government. Iraq is majority Shia, but Saddam Hussein was a Sunni, and it was a secular government. It was not a religious government. It was a secular government under the Ba'ath government of Saddam Hussein that was overthrown. Right. And that after the overthrow of the Iraqi government, U.S. media really just started pushing the idea, well, there's going to be a Sunni Shia war. There's going to be a Sunni Shia war. I mean, it was like they were making it happen. The U.S. government gave everyone in Iraq a government ID that specifically listed their religious identity. Anyone who had any role in the previous government, down to like the local council or the local city manager, because you'd been part of the previous government, you were banned. And then all the government jobs were handed out on the basis of your religious identity. Are you Sunni? Are you Shia? Are you Kurdish? Etc. And because of that, obviously there was huge ethnic strife. Iran, their government, is a Shia Islamic government. And so Iran immediately did everything it could to, support and protect the Shia communities of Iraq. Then, as a result of that, you had the Sunni forces that very much hate Iran for, there was the Iraq-Iran war, there's ethnic conflict, etc. You had the Sunni forces then, who view Shias as apostates, as not true Muslims. You had them getting support from Saudi Arabia, and you had kind of a wing of what you might call radical Islam that developed that said that Shia Islam was the main enemy, that Shia Muslims are apostates, that Shia Muslims are not true Muslims, and what you call Takfiriism or Salafism, or Wahhabi Islam, the Saudi interpretation of Islam, that was widely promoted throughout the region, said that Iran was the main enemy, said that because Bashar Assad, he's technically a Shia Muslim. He's an obscure form of a Shia Muslim called an Alawite. And because Iran are Shia, that Iran is trying to take over the world and form a Shia caliphate or a Shia crescent, and that Shia Muslims are the main enemy. And these forces, you're asking why they didn't attack Israel, they are a particular wing of Wahhabi Islamic fanaticism. It comes out of the wing of Osama bin Laden and his kind of ideology, but it's a kind of a spin-off of that says Shia Muslims are the main enemy. And they want to overthrow the Syrian government because they see that Bashar Assad is an Alawite. They want to fight against Iran because they consider Iran to be the main, country that is promoting Shia Islam all over the region, and that they want to promote Islamic sectarianism rather than fight Israel. And ISIS is probably the biggest expression of this. We saw the ISIS terrorists, what they did, and they very much viewed Shia Muslims as apostates and thought their main aim was to kill Shia Muslims. They've carried out attacks against the Islamic Republic of Iran. Their focus was overthrowing the Syrian government. They also fought in Iraq against Shia militias and Shia organizations. And that's why they're not fighting Israel, is they believe the main enemy is Shia.
I see. Okay, fair enough. I accept that. Does it also have something to do with the fact that Israel was supporting, meaning I can show you articles where they pointed out that Israel was funding some of these groups and even showing Netanyahu at the hospitals that were treating many of the fighters that were fleeing from the battlefield into Israeli hospitals. Like, meaning it seems that Israel gave express support to this group, but I guess that makes sense. If this group was perfectly willing to go after certain groups of Muslims and not others, then Israel might have just seen them as an ally in that effort. But correct me if I'm wrong on that.
Well, no, you're not wrong. And the thing is that, Iran is the, Shia Muslim government, kind of the center of world Shia Islam. And it also just so happens Iran is the country that Israel considers to be its greatest enemy. So it would make sense that if there's a group of radical Muslims out there who think that their main focus should be on fighting and killing Shia Muslims, that Israel would back them. And evidence of that certainly existed. You alluded to those hospitals, right? And that there's the occupied Golan Heights, a territory of Syria that's been seized by Israel. And in the Golan Heights, there was medical assistance that was being given to, these kind of fighters, and ISIS and other extremist fighters that were working against the Syrian government were being backed by Israel. That was clear. And it doesn't match what Israeli propaganda would tell you, right? Israel's supposed to be the bastion of civilization against and all Muslims are supposed to be barbaric, primitive, people. And that's Israel's this stronghold of civilization, and they're modern. And these are all barbaric, primitive Muslims. That's what Israeli propaganda tends to promote. But it seems like the most extreme and conservative and sectarian Muslims have been, to some degree or other, backed by Israel in their fight against the Syrian government, in their fight against Iran. And that doesn't match, right? And that U.S. mainstream media throughout all of this has really kind of depended on Americans' ignorance. There's a clown named Trevor Loudon who works for Epoch Times, and he made a film that was supposed to explain everything. It was called Soviet Islam. And it was supposed to explain Russia was the cause of Islamic terrorism around the world. And the image that he used to promote this film was Saddam Hussein shaking hands with Brezhnev. And I just looked at this and I'm just like, oh my goodness, Saddam Hussein was a secular leader. This is complete ignorance, right? And that, you're not supposed to realize that Saddam Hussein was a secular Arab nationalist, that Iran is Shia, that ISIS are Wahhabis who want to kill Shia. You're supposed to just think, oh, these are all a bunch of primitive people and we got to support Israel because they're not primitive like this. And it's much more complicated. There are different forces at play here in the Middle East and elsewhere. And Israel and the United States have been one of the main promoters of the most extreme and dangerous, forms of Islamic terrorism. We know Osama bin Laden got his start fighting the Soviet Union in Afghanistan. And I mean, I've always said to people, show me where Al-Qaeda was not on the side of the American government. Show me where ISIS was not on the side of the American government. The guy who blew up the concert in Manchester, you remember that horrendous bombing that happened a few years back? Well, that guy had been somebody who he and his father had gone to Libya and gotten supported by the British and the American government to fight against Gaddafi. And they were Islamic radical extremists who hated Gaddafi because he wasn't, enough of a Muslim for them. He was secular and he had women in the government, etc. So they went around Libya bombing and killing and torturing people. And then they came back to Britain and decided to blow up a concert where some, they thought, this woman was scantily clad, it was sinful or whatever. And that you go down the line, these horrendous terrorist attacks that have happened in the United States, they tend to be done by forces that are supporting the United States. Who were the Zarnev brothers? You remember the Zarnev brothers who blew up the Boston Marathon? Well, they were Chechens, and their parents were Chechen separatists who were backed by the United States to fight against Russia, to try and break Chechnya away from Russia. And the Russian government actually flagged them and said to the United States, watch these Zarnev brothers. We've been tracking their activity online. We think they might be doing something. The American government didn't listen, and they blew up the Boston Marathon. And there's many examples. The Pulse nightclub shooting. That guy, his father was an Afghan who was anti-Soviet, had been moving against the Soviet Union in Afghanistan, and that's where he came from. There was another bombing in New Jersey. I think the New Jersey bomber. Also, again, his father had been somebody who'd fought against the Soviet Union in Afghanistan, and that these are the most extreme Wahhabi fanatical forces that tend to be backed by the United States against kind of Arab nationalist or socialist or anti-imperialist governments. And because Americans think all Muslims are the same, and because people, this is a different region, a different culture, a different history, we kind of don't see that the most dangerous and extreme Muslim radicals are the ones backed by the United States, and it's the more sensible, nationalistic, constructive forces, whether it's Arab nationalists or the Islamic Republic of Iran. They're the ones the U.S. government targets. People have said, we're supposedly fighting a war on terror, but really the United States has functioned as Al-Qaeda's air force for the last couple decades, and that instead of fighting the terrorists, we've fought all the terrorists' enemies. Saddam Hussein was a secular Arab leader, was a big enemy of the terrorists. He's been overthrown, and now ISIS set up shop in Iraq, and it's been chaos ever since, right? Gaddafi was so actually cooperative with the war on terror. He even offered to torture people for the American government. And after 9/11, Gaddafi, he came forward. I said, I've been fighting these people for years. Please let's team up. Let's fight them. And the Syrian government said the same thing. Wow, Wahhabi, bin Laden, we've been fighting these people for years. Let's team up. Let's cooperate against them. Syria and Libya were both big supporters of the U.S. war on terror because they'd been dealing with the Wahhabi extremist fanatics that wanted to overthrow them, and they thought it was an opportunity to cooperate. Well, the United States is focused on overthrowing them. Meanwhile, the ideology that a lot of these folks have is Wahhabism, which comes from Saudi Arabia. And Saudi Arabia has long been the biggest ally of the Western powers in the Middle East. The Saudi government, the very borders were drawn up by the British Empire. The British backed the Saudi forces. They were seen as kind of vassals and allies of the British Empire, and they are completely tied in with ExxonMobil, BP, and Shell and Chevron, all the American oil companies. And so the way we kind of understand things is just completely twisted.
Yeah, it's very warped. I had a conversation with a good friend of mine last night. And as we were talking about the media, I was pointing out to him that, it often feels like you're walking through a fog because of what they say. Like they say stuff that is so twisted or lack of context that pushes people into a certain point of view. And it's done constantly over and over and over again, especially if you're talking about governments that we don't necessarily like. Is it fair to say that this was never a civil war? Because the way they talked about it back during the Obama administration was there's the Arab Spring. You have all of these groups and these people who are very angry at the Syrian government. And being angry at the Syrian government, it flared up into a resistance against the government, in which case there was a civil war that various groups across the Middle East that hated the Syrian government joined in on. That was the narrative. Was this ever a civil war, though? For that matter, was Libya really a civil war, looking back on it? Give me your take on both of those.
Well, foreign fighters were essential in both of those conflicts, no question about it. There were protests in Libya and Syria and throughout the Middle East in 2011. Now, we know the American government had a lot to do with fomenting those protests, with the with Twitter and Facebook, which were very new. Jared Andrew Cohen, who was working as the liaison between the Hillary Clinton State Department and the tech giants, Google, Facebook, Twitter, etc., and that certainly was a reality of how the Arab Spring happened, but it did represent what a lot of people in that region wanted. There was a lot of unemployment coming out of the financial crisis. There was a big drought, so a lot of the folks in the countryside were moving to the cities to try and find work, and so there were certain genuine sentiments that were kind of hijacked to just kind of create these widespread protests, and then what started out as widespread protests for a variety of reasons, you then had religious fanatical forces take control of it. And most of the people that protested against the Syrian government in 2011, most of them were secular to some degree or other, and most of them did not support the fanatical religious extremists who ultimately became the main force fighting against the Syrian government. So it's kind of a distortion to directly link them to the protests. It was the instability of the protests. It was kind of the unrest that created an opening for these forces. But foreign fighters were key in Libya. Foreign fighters were key and have always been key in Syria. Jordanians, people from throughout the region who were trained, who were, cultivated. In Turkey, they had training camps for them. In Jordan, they had training camps for them, and they would send them over the border to kill. And that's been essential. And that the Libyan government was brought down, and Gaddafi defeated the insurgents on the battlefield every time. So then cruise missiles from NATO had to ultimately finish off the Libyan government because Gaddafi was going to win on the battlefield every time. In Syria, the Syrian government has been successful mainly because they've gotten support from Russia. They have the support of the population, no question about it. And then Russia was able to come to their aid. And because of that, the Syrian government remains intact. And that the Syrian government represents the bulk of the population. 80% of the people in Syria are Sunni Muslims. That is a very solid majority. But yet they, as a group, most Syrians line up with wanting to have a society where Christians are free to practice their faith, where different other religious minorities are free to practice their faith, where there's labor unions in the factories, where you have different political parties in the government, including not just the ruling Ba'athist Arab Socialist Party, but also the Communist Party, also the Syrian Social Nationalist Party. That Syria is for the region, right? I mean, look, who is it that the USA is aligned with? You got the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. You got the Kingdom of Qatar. You got the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan. Right? These are countries that are not in any way democratic. They are ruled by ruling families who were given it, by the British. The British had the Sykes-Picot Agreement after World War I. They drew the borders of these countries. They picked, their most loyal, puppets, and they put them in charge of a region, and they became the absolute rulers. Qatar, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, etc. These are absolute monarchies. Whereas, it's the Syrian Arab Republic. And they have elections and they have different political parties. And you can argue that, there's corruption. You can argue there's problems, and there absolutely are. But these countries are at least, having having elections to some degree. And they have religious minorities that have roles in the government, and they have constitutions and laws. It's the Republic of Iraq under Saddam Hussein. It's the Islamic Republic of Iran. And these are countries that have established some form of independence that has led to kind of a government that is more representative of what the people there want. It's not just a monarchy that was imposed by the former colonizers. And again, people want to just sit back, and of course every criticism of the Iraqi government or the Syrian government or of the Iranian government comes up, and there's plenty of room for criticism there. But you have to admit, these countries are the more advanced and more progressive countries, and they're the ones the United States targets for that reason, because as far as the Western imperialists would like it, they see the Middle East as a giant, oil facility where they can extract the oil, and they really don't want development. They don't want these countries to rise up and industrialize and become, modern countries. Whereas that is the aim of the Ba'athist element in Iraq and Syria, and that was also the aim of the Islamic Republic, is economic development, modernizing. And at one point in the 1980s, the Soviet Union was openly talking about a massive irrigation system, throughout that region, and kind of bringing the Middle East into the modern world with development as a way of bringing stability and resolving the Israel-Palestine conflict. And it's very tragic that the Soviet Union's plan for the region was never really put into effect, because if the Soviet Union had been able to work towards greening the deserts and bring economic development, etc., the Middle East wouldn't just be kind of the world's oil refinery. It would be something more prosperous, and you'd have less violence and instability. And I think that many people view the election of Menachem Begin in 1978, the hard right prime minister of Israel, as a negative turning point. Because there was some hope that, with the Soviet Union there, and with the rise of Baathism and Arab nationalism, that in the 70s, the Middle East could have gone in a good direction. But the rise of Menachem Begin and a number of forces, and then ultimately the fall of the Soviet Union, it's led things in a different direction. But I'm optimistic, because I hear not just, from modern Russia, but also from China, echoes of what the Soviet Union's plan for the Middle East was, peace through development. Because at the end of the day, right, if people have good paying jobs, if people have economic opportunity, they don't join terrorist groups. They don't join extremist groups. They don't become drug dealers. They don't become, terrorist killers. They enjoy economic prosperity. The way to bring peace is with economic development. That's why I'm excited about, what the Taliban is doing. It seems that the Taliban at this moment is pivoting towards some kind of economic development program. And as much as I'm not a fan of the Taliban and their ideology, et cetera, if they can bring economic development, that will bring stability to Afghanistan. And that is the road to peace. And that's also the road to human rights. The way we talk about human rights, I just want to say this. The way we talk about human rights in the West is completely messed up. We talk about it as if it's a moral thing, right? There's good countries that have freedom. There's bad countries that don't have freedom. Nobody anywhere in the world was talking about the rights of man, freedom of speech, freedom of religion until like the 1400s in Europe. Why? Because people were just evil until then? Well, no, because a level of economic development, the rise of modern capitalism, replacing feudalism, created a level of economic development in society that could facilitate that level of freedom. And that freedom is always intrinsically tied up with development and stability in any society. And we need to understand it that way.
Man, I am so glad you said that. One of my, I have, it's ideological, fair enough, but I tend to believe that if you leave countries to their own devices, that those countries would develop, meaning issues, and not just develop economically, but also develop from the standpoint of rights, like that human rights will come out of that level of economic development. It's not magic. It's not just something that comes out of the ether per se. I absolutely agree with you on that. On one of the other catches, and I also want to back up what you were pointing out about this Arab Spring. Our fingers were all over that. Seymour Hersh, back, when did he put this article out? I think back in like 2007, was talking about how there was a strategic shift into Syria and some of the other countries with the idea of destabilizing those countries to go after, well, Iran in that case, but these days it's going to be Russia's probably at the top of the list on that. I also want to play this clip by Joe Biden. This is a famous clip where Joe Biden is talking about all of the groups that were interested in getting involved in Syria and how all of the money was going into it. And I have a question for you after this clip.
What my constant cry was that our biggest problem is our allies.
It's a bit low. I hope you can hear it.
Our allies in the region were our largest problem in Syria. The Turks were great friends, and I have a great relationship with Erdogan, which I just spent a lot of time with. The Saudis.
All right, this clip is very hard to hear. What he's saying is the Turks, Saudis, all of these groups all around the world were putting in money, jihadis, etc., to overthrow the government of Syria. And of course, we were fully aware of it and were a party to it. I guess my question is, that's not true today, though, right? Like, from my understanding, the reporting came out that Saudi Arabia, UAE, even Qatar was against this, terrorist, Turkey-backed, NATO-backed terrorist group trying to overthrow Syria now because Syria has been brought back into the fold. That there was a lot of diplomatic work that Syria was doing in order to ingratiate itself back into this kind of Arab League. In fact, they were even at the recent Arab League that last took place. So is it true that back in, let's say, 2007, all of these groups were involved in trying to overthrow the government, 2008, whatever the year was, but involved in trying to overthrow it. But today, the context of the Middle East has changed in such a way, but that's not what those countries want. What's your take on this? Is that true?
It's absolutely true, and that a lot has changed. And I've been telling people that essentially the Obama era strategy completely failed. Obama's strategy was to polarize the Muslim world and the Middle East between allies of Iran and allies of the United States. And that strategy continued in Donald Trump's first term. He went there to try and build an Arab NATO, et cetera. He did the Abraham Accords, trying to get Israel to be more friendly with the countries that were against Iran. But it's completely failed. And the first game changer was the conflict in Ukraine, because the United States made the demand on Saudi Arabia, you need to go all in and just go all in against Russia. And the Saudi monarchy was like, wait a second, Russia's got a huge amount of oil. We've got a huge amount of oil. We need to be able to call up the Russians on the phone, and they need to be able to call us on the phone, because the amount of oil that we put out on the market has a lot to do with the price going up and down, right? The price of oil goes up and down based on how much oil goes out. And so Saudi Arabia and Russia have to have a relationship in order, for the world economy to be stable. And so the demand that Saudi Arabia just completely cut all ties with Russia and join the bandwagon against Russia, the crown prince was just not going to do that. And so that was the beginning, that Saudi Arabia was just not all in against Russia when the Biden administration demanded it. And then the icing on the cake was October 7th and Israel's, campaign of aggression since then. The whole Muslim world is unified in opposition to it. And also the main people that, the main force that has been opposing Israel, the people who just kind of became the most, key fighters against Israel were the Houthis in Yemen that are an Iran-aligned group. And so everyone who opposed Israel was kind of cheering for the Houthis as they were blocking ships and engaging in their, solidarity with the Palestinians. And so the idea you're going to isolate Iran and its allies, that faded very quickly. And at this point, the Muslim world is just not buying into this idea that we need to be Sunnis versus Shia. We need to have the allies of Iran be isolated, and the allies of the United States can drift closer to Israel because Iran's the main threat. That's just not how the Muslim world sees things anymore. During the Obama administration, that perspective certainly took hold, but that's long gone. And at this point, Saudi Arabia, is willing, has sat down with the Islamic Republic of Iran in negotiations that were, facilitated by China. And now the two countries have diplomatic relations with each other. And Syria has been readmitted into the Arab League as a recognized government. And the Arab countries recognize Syria as the legitimate government. They're not, conferring support onto some rebel faction. And the Obama era strategy of polarizing the Middle East, it failed. I mean, it just completely failed. And now what Israel's doing is unifying Muslims even more. They're all united against what Israel is doing. And so, that strategy, the Sunni Shia conflict, the dividing, the Arab NATO, the Abraham Accords, that's all just forgotten. Just forget it.
I want to move to Trump for a bit. Yeah. And
Sure.
to one point, I want to move to Trump, but one more question on this.
Yeah.
This is a clear reason why Russia is not going to allow a frozen conflict, right? Like, all things being equal, like, the last thing they want is a situation where Zelensky recently came out and said, okay, we can cede territory, but we need to be part of NATO immediately. Okay, well, this is the frozen conflict stuff that was being floated. And, this idea that part of Ukraine is going to rebuild and then potentially launch another military invasion and being backed by NATO. Also, like, that is going to be outlandish. I don't even know how they would have the capability of even freezing the conflict if Russia didn't necessarily agree to it. It's, these guys are moving faster than what they were prior. They're taking more territory than what they were prior, and they're killing more Ukrainians even faster. I mean, I guess my point is, isn't Syria and what is taking place in Syria right now the exact reason why Russia would never accept any terms of a frozen conflict, even if Donald Trump comes in and tries to propose such.
Well, okay. So when you say frozen conflict, that's kind of a euphemism that American politicians use, but it's really just pointing to the reality of what William S. Lind, the Pentagon strategist, has referred to as fourth generation warfare. Look, we're in an era where if the USA and Russia directly went to war, humanity would end. There would be a nuclear exchange, and that would be the end of the world. If China and the United States directly went to war, nuclear exchange, the end of humanity. And really, since the end of the Second World War, since the rise of atomic weapons, but really, especially since the 1970s, more of a reality, it's become the fact that you can't have direct conflict between great powers. And so war is fought by proxies. It's fought with, states that are contested. And the main way that war is carried out is not by states and their official militaries, but it's by what they refer to as non-state actors, political movements, religious movements, etc. And they battle each other and they enter alliances with different states. And there's kind of a geopolitical chess game that is fought as different non-state actors are backed by different forces, and different states are backed by different forces. And there's kind of a geopolitical chess game because great powers can't directly fight one another. And so when you talk about a frozen conflict, that the idea of a frozen conflict, I guess the way they present it is the countries, there's still tension there between different forces, but they're not technically at war, but there's just kind of, there's things, kind of like Northern Ireland, there's a lot of Irish folks that want the 6 counties to return, but the conflict is technically not going on, but there's still tension there. I mean, that's just kind of a reality of geopolitics in our time, right? There's going to be tensions in various regions, and there's going to be groups that disagree with each other, and there's going to be different powers kind of, strategically backing those groups for their own reasons as they contend with each other, because the great powers can no longer directly clash with one another. So I think frozen conflicts are just kind of the reality of our era. Ultimately, I think if we were to move toward the dream of just kind of accepting multipolarity, if the United States and the NATO countries could just recognize that it's a new world, and that there's going to be other centers of power in the world. The world's just not going to be centered around the West as it once was. I think that could certainly de-escalate. But unless that kind of comes into existence, we're going to see what you might call frozen conflicts around the world. That's just going to be kind of a reality of what we deal with. And it's fourth generation warfare. It's the reality of how war is fought in our time.
I get that. I get the sense that Russia is willing to take all of Ukraine as opposed to allowing it to freeze. And that frozen conflict thing is exactly why. Like, I understand the tension thing. I mean, the reality of it is, though, my fear is that they sleepwalk into direct engagement, which honestly could really take place in Ukraine right now, especially if Donald Trump comes in with this kind of pressure campaign and not willing to accept the deal or the agreement that Putin puts on the table. And I want to move to Trump, because Donald Trump is over and over again saying, I want to have peace, not war. I want to stop wars, not start wars. I applauded Trump for going to North Korea. I thought it was fantastic. And he was attacked for it, which is astonishing. I mean, even on the campaign trail, they were attacking him for making deals or trying to make agreements with North Korea to bring down hostilities. And it worked. It was proof of concept that we didn't necessarily have to have belligerent foreign policy to every government. You were hosting or being a part of an organization that is trying to push Trump into doing this and to do it more. I want you to explain what that is, because I went through your article yesterday and I agreed with you that we do need to push Trump in a particular direction, even though Trump is somewhat of a wild card. And I don't necessarily know exactly where Donald Trump is going to go, but I do know between the two political parties, he's the one that is most open to making deals, if a deal can be reached. Give me your point in that, and tell the audience the date of that rally that is being held in relation to this. Please go into it for me.
Well, okay, so my organization, we're called the Center for Political Innovation. We've been around for a few years, and we facilitate discussion, et cetera. Our main way of intervening in the last month of the election cycle in October is we marched through the streets of New York City with an 8x12 banner That's pretty big, 8x12. And, you know, it gets windy in New York, so it's almost like a big sail. It's kind of heavy to carry around. But we had an 8x12 banner with Trump and Kim Jong-un shaking hands with the slogan, "Only peace can make America great again." We took that banner to Trump Tower. We took that banner to the New York Public Library. And then when Trump had his big rally at Madison Square Garden, we unfurled it there as well. And we were featured in New Yorker magazine. They quoted me and they talked about our banner in New Yorker magazine. And we were just part of the political scenery in New York with our slogan, "Only peace can make America great again," pointing to the fact that when Donald Trump went to North Korea, that was a great step forward, right? It was, you know, a country, you could call it a frozen conflict, right? There's, you know, two governments on the Korean Peninsula that have been at odds with each other. The USA doesn't recognize or have diplomatic relations with North Korea, but yet Trump took the first move toward possibly bridging that divide. And, you know, we thought that was a great step forward. What I thought was interesting is that Trump bragged about that on the campaign trail many times. He said, "I went to North Korea, I met with Kim Jong-un, etc." And his own side told him to stop doing that. The Wall Street Journal criticized Trump, and they said, "Don't do that. Don't bring that up. It didn't go anyplace. It was not good." But he kept doing it. He's just like, Trump is proud that he went to North Korea, and he wants to do more things like that. And I think Donald Trump also realizes that his hope for making a deal and improving relations with North Korea was sabotaged by his own side. John Bolton and Mike Pompeo both went to North Korea with Trump, and John Bolton was pretty blatantly trying to sabotage it the whole time. Mike Pompeo, not as much openly, but Mike Pompeo has since betrayed Donald Trump around, you know, calling for him to be prosecuted, you know, for documents, etc. And that that Trump was kind of being sabotaged by his own side. And then you'll recall that during the process of those peace talks, individuals in Spain that were pretty widely reported in the Spanish press to be CIA individuals raided the North Korean embassy in Spain and attacked the North Korean embassy, stole a bunch of laptops, etc. And that was done just as a provocation, just to antagonize North Korea. And that a big section of the American deep state was saying, "We don't want peace with North Korea. We will not allow this to happen." And Trump was trying to have peace with North Korea. And Trump's, you know, ally and friend, Mike, what's his name? He's the investor from Singapore. Jim Rogers. Jim Rogers, the legendary investor, he was backing Trump in trading and trying to improve relations with North Korea. Jim Rogers, and there were a number of other forces that were supporting Trump in trying to make peace with North Korea, but the American intelligence apparatus and the deep state was trying to prevent it. And that the thing that I think is interesting, you can put this in the context of the new reports. You know, Anya Parampil put out the report saying that that apparently Trump and Maduro were going to meet during Trump's first term, and then Mike Pompeo sabotaged that, and that it seems like that within the Trump administration, there are different goals. And there is a very pragmatic pro-peace side to the Trump administration that wants to improve relations with different countries, that sees that as a way that America can become more prosperous because we're trading with different countries, et cetera. And there is the old neoconservative regime change apparatus and some special immigrant communities that have a bone to pick. That's important too. I mean, a big part of the Trump coalition is, you know, you have the Epoch Times, the Falun Gong. Those are folks that hate the Chinese government, and they just have a bone to pick against the Chinese government. You got the Miami Cubans. They hate the Cuban government. And that, so on the one hand, you've got these particular immigrant communities that have a real vendetta, and they're going to push Trump to, you know, be as provocative and regime change oriented in their particular country, in their particular region. But then you also have folks like Tulsi Gabbard and others that just kind of want to, you know, improve U.S. relations and see that the strategy of regime change is not playing out in the interest of the United States in the long term. So there's different forces within the Trump administration. And I know a lot of people, I'm not thrilled about Marco Rubio being appointed. I think Marco Rubio is, you know, I mean, I can't think of somebody I disagree with more politically. But that said, I don't think people should just give up, right? If you just say, "Oh, look, he appointed Marco Rubio. Oh, it's all over," you're giving up. You're admitting defeat, because there's also Tulsi Gabbard. There's also Matt Gaetz, who was going to be Attorney General, and now he's going to be special counsel investigating the FBI. He just appointed an FBI director, you know, as somebody who's at odds with the FBI historically. So there's going to be struggle within the Trump administration. And that if we just kind of stand back and oppose it, we're not going to be part of the conflict. We're not going to be able to nudge things. We would like to nudge things in an anti-imperialist direction. But that requires, maneuvering and making alliances and trying to insert ideas and things like that, like we did with our Trump-Kim banner. I wrote my book about Kamala Harris that was banned from Amazon and then exploded in popularity and all of that. Again, you have to find openings and intervene. That's what being serious about politics is. Is that, when the American Civil War happened, right? We could have just sat back and said, oh, Lincoln is racist. He's just as bad as the South. But serious forces like Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass and others said, look, Lincoln might have his flaws, but he is opposed to the slaveholders. And the slaveholders aren't going to accept him, even though he doesn't want to abolish slavery. He just wants to keep it from expanding. And that created an opening through which a lot of progressive forces could intervene. And ultimately, that led to the defeat of slavery, the Second American Revolution, right? And that the way change happens is not by just kind of sitting back and throwing your arms up and condemning. It's by seeing openings and divisions within the power structure, by using that to create movements and push forward your own unique message. And that's the way I see things. And that there's that old meme from The Simpsons. I don't know if you've ever seen Old Man Yells at Cloud, right? It's a meme from The Simpsons, right? And it's got, Grandpa Simpson and he's there. Old Man yells at cloud. In the age of social media, a lot of people think that's all they can be, right? Is that the world is just going to happen, but I can be on my Facebook or my Twitter complaining about it, right? And that, people will like my complaining, maybe share my complaining. I can complain in a unique way and all of that. Well, I'm here to challenge people and say, no, you can actually intervene in history. You can make a difference, but in order to do that, you have to be able to work with people you might disagree. You have to look for openings, et cetera, and all of that. We plan to attend the inauguration and to bring our Trump-Kim banner to the inauguration, along with a new banner about the peace bridge over the Bering Sea, because there have been plans for years to connect Alaska to Russia with a bridge. And I think Donald Trump could do it. I think Donald Trump could start the construction of the Bering Sea bridge connecting Alaska to Russia, and that would pivot our economy eastward away from NATO. It would get us in on the action of the, every year they have the Vladivostok Economic Forum in Russia, where, you can see there's so much economic development happening there with, the Eurasian Economic Union, and there's the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and the Belt and Road, and that it could get us in on that action. So we're going to bring our Trump-Kim banner, Only Peace Can Make America Great Again. We're also bringing a new banner we'll be bringing with us, also huge, 8x12, about the peace bridge connecting Alaska to Russia. And then that evening, we're having a reception in Washington, D.C. To put forward, we need to figure out how we can engage with the new administration to push it in an anti-war direction in whatever way is possible.
Caleb, man, I appreciate this. Thank you for this. And I'm going to put the link at the bottom in the description of the event that you guys are having. Look, I think you're right. I said over the course of the election that Donald Trump should have been praised for when he was pushing for peace. That's a good thing. That's not necessarily a bad thing.
Let me ask you, Jamarl, you're in D.C., right?
Yeah.
Can you come to the event? Are you available that day?
Yes. Absolutely, yes.
All right. I'll see you there.
I will be there. I'm going to put that in my calendar.
I'm looking forward, and I'll be looking forward to your remarks. I'm sure many people that are watching now will be very excited to meet you there. So there you go.
Absolutely. Caleb Maupin. He is a speaker, writer, journalist, political analyst, and author. In his book, Kamala Harris and the Future of America, an essay in 3 parts, he examines the life of Kamala Harris and puts it into context and the prominence of the context of the changing U.S. political discourse and the geopolitical stage. You can follow Caleb on Twitter at Caleb Maupin and read his articles at calebmaupin.com. Check him out. Every time the man opens his mouth, he says amazing things. Thank you, Caleb. I really appreciate it.
And thank you